This is Miao Xiaojuan in Brussels. It has been 5 years since Lehman Brothers declared bankruptcy and 4 years since Greece exposed alarming increase in government debt levels. So in what ways have the global financial crisis and the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis changed Europe and its ambitious integration project? To find out the full impacts of the crisis on European integration, today I have invited Professor Alison Woodward to join us in the studio. Professor Woodward is a senior expert and policy consultant from the Vrije Universiteit Brussel. Thank you for coming. So, Professor, your research interests are in the field of comparative public policy and organization of the European Union. You must be closely following the Union's policy changes in reaction to the crisis and people's trust or distrust towards closer integration. But before our discussion, let's have a look at some street interviews in the heart of Europe.
I think I'll be voting for UKIP to withdraw from the EU.
La verdad es que no. Me gustaría confiar en que Europa puede hacer algo por todos, pero al final es una lucha de poder entre países y cuando va mal, pues cada uno va a lo suyo. Así que no confío mucho en lo que pueda hacer Europa.
Everybody's worried, so people aren't so carefree as they used to be, very carefree with what they did. Now they're being more careful and they're thinking about things before they do things, which is good.
La sola austerità non può portare a alcun tipo di sviluppo economico, assolutamente.
I feel strongly about the migration that is happening from the EU because we are one of the better off countries.
Porque yo creo que es bueno para todos, para España y para los demás países de Europa.
I hope that the politicians will change and help their countries and not take advantage of the people so much.
Hombre, porque yo creo que tendemos a eso, a una unificazione, no a una separazione.
Perché poi ci dicono che dobbiamo essere ottimisti. Voglio essere ottimista, ma certo non è che sia, insomma.
So, Professor, looks like the crisis has calmed down and global investors have renewed their confidence in European economies. But still, many Europeans are feeling uncertain about their future and Europe's future. So do you think European politicians are actually listening to their voices and addressing their concerns?
I'm absolutely certain that politicians are listening and are very worried about the concerns of the people because, of course, the concerns of the people will affect their future. In many countries, including Belgium, there will be major elections this spring, and most people expect that the crisis will have an influence on how people vote. So politicians depend on the voters, and the voters' concerns will be theirs, certainly for the next few months.
Could you briefly evaluate the performance of European institutions and national governments in handling the crisis?
Briefly evaluate is a tall order because, of course, this has been a long and complex crisis. Initially, it was characterized as being a financial crisis, as you mentioned, Lehman Brothers, but gradually it expanded, it became an economic crisis, and at this present point it's a social and economic crisis. So it's been a long period, more than 5 years, as you pointed out, of continuing changes and continuing problems. And with 28 countries, national governments, a new government has joined the European Union on the one hand, so 28 national economies, and institutions with various kinds of responsibilities at the European level on the other. It's very difficult to have a simple answer to the extent to which it was effective or not, because there were many, many pieces to the story. So in some areas we can see success, in other areas recovery looks very difficult, and it may be a long-term and depth problem that will have to be addressed over the next 10 years rather than the next 2 years. So a crisis that has already been 5 or 6 years in the running is going to also have consequences further into the future.
Is European Union getting stronger or weaker throughout the crisis?
Well, like any good professor, I will say, in some ways, it has been getting stronger. There's certainly been more Europe, so the instruments that are available to the European Union have been expanded in the crisis, and there's a tighter grip on the economy. There's much more harmonization between national governments, more openness about revealing budgets. There's actually requirements to reveal and have your budget controlled. So in that way, there certainly has been more Europe. But the problem is a little bit on how Europe is perceived by the citizens. I think if you look around at how the crisis and interventions from the European Union have been presented, it's oftentimes Angela Merkel who represents Europe rather than Herman Van Rompuy or Barroso. So Europe is still perceived as a group of member states, and the strength of the European Union at this point is very much resting on the shoulders of the stronger member states. So we still have a hierarchical situation where the stronger member states are perceived as dictating the actions of the European Union. Weaker because of the structural and economic consequences of the crisis. The grass on which the European Union stands, its people, has been weakened. So citizens, because of cuts in the welfare system, because of cuts to pension, are many times in a situation of looming poverty, of relative decline of their situation and living, of hopeless futures for young people who've invested in their education. And this is a perfect ground for political discontent. And this is a very dangerous situation, and we see it playing out in several of the polities in the European Union, particularly in the South. Spain, Italy, Greece have all been hit very hard by this crisis, and the people are looking for alternatives in a kind of a black and white situation which can threaten the unity in the European Union. So in this way, I think the crisis has weakened some of the things in the European Union which we have taken for granted in the past. Certainly a concern for the well-being of its citizens. Many people perceive the austerity measures as being contrary to social interests and actually potentially putting a brake on the growth that is so necessary in terms of jobs and the economy. So I was spending more time on the weakening than on the strengths, so you may read in my answer that the crisis has not been good. One of the particular things that concerns sociologists is the growing gap between the rich and the poor. The well-to-do in all of the Western nations have actually become more well-to-do in the crisis. So there is an irony in this, but the rich have become richer. And one of the indicators of well-being is, of course, the distance between the very rich and the less well-off. And that has, in most of the countries in the European Union, grown. So by taking away different kinds of state provisions for taxes, for example, to stimulate the economy, the rich have become more rich, and the people on the bottom have become less well off. And what's dangerous is, of course, that there is a gap. It's not so much that the amount, but it's the perceived, how far away is it from becoming a very rich person. So we have a lot more billionaires, but we also have a lot of people that will never, ever become billionaires. So that's a long answer to your question, but these are all social factors that will affect the future of the European Union.
It looks like socially you think European countries are some way and the European Union are getting a little bit divided concerning the gap. But many politicians have argued that the crisis can be a double-edged sword. It challenged jobs and growth, but it also pushed for closer integration. So do you think Europe is getting divided, or more united, both socially, economically, and politically?
Well, I think economically, as we already started out, that it's become more and more united. There's a number of measures, strengthening of the bank system, more common regulations, the requirement to present the budget centrally to all of the European countries. All of these things indicate that the integration in terms of economics has been going apace. Politically, I think the answer, political integration, is very mixed, depending on the situation of the countries. So it's difficult to say that this has led towards more political integration. Some people call for a bigger role for the parliament, for example. I'm not necessarily seeing this coming in the near future because the European Union, as I think we might talk about later, is becoming increasingly unpopular. And then socially, I think the honeymoon is over for the countries that joined in the middle of the last decade, 2005, 2006. And we have one country that is still in the honeymoon. I spent my vacation in Croatia. And even there, I did not see euphoric gladness about being a member of the European Union in its present state. So at that level, socially, I don't see that has grown in terms of integration. I don't think it has gone backwards either, though. I would be very cautious to say, yes, the crisis has meant that people want to drop out of the European Union. I don't think that that's the case.
Okay, and speaking of unity, European Union always has a motto, unity in diversity. So what are the major sources of unity and diversity in Europe?
Well, I think the double-edged sword that you talked about earlier is also plays in unity and diversity. Many of the sources of unity are also potential sources of diversity, of division. I take one of the main factors that's oftentimes mentioned, and that is a common history. It sounds bizarre, but actually the experience of the wars in the last 100 years have been very important for every single member of the European Union. They stood on opposite sides in these wars, but they shared the experience of war. And that experience plays into the desire for peace in the European Union. I think the only conflict that we've had within the European Union borders that has led to big violence is in Northern Ireland. So, and the new countries that are coming in, for example, Croatia and Slovenia, are both countries that were affected by war in the beginning of the 90s. And joining the European Union is sometimes seen as a guarantee that there will be no more war between the neighbors in the European Union. So history is certainly something that plays a part. Another thing that has been important is the role of the elites. Again, today, an elite, how important is that? It used to be, certainly in the beginning of my career as a political sociologist, I was very interested in elites because they played an extremely important role. And that's always been the case in Europe. So the aristocracy in Europe was also European. They married across borders, and they were very European-minded, whereas the rest of the population wasn't. Today, that is also the case. A program like Erasmus trains university students who are the future elite and has them live in different European countries. So that group of people who will be opinion leaders, people who will be working in the media, in the universities, and in the top of business, is quite European-minded. And they, too, are going to be contributing to unity. So these kinds of factors, I think, are optimistic in some ways towards unity.
I have a latest survey from Eurobarometer showing that over 45% of Europeans are actually pessimistic about the future of the European Union. Back in 2007, that figure was only 25%. So has the crisis become the biggest blow to the confidence of the Europeans towards the European Union?
I think it contributed, but I don't think you can blame everything on the crisis. I think if you, although the figures about satisfaction with the European Union have been surprisingly constant over the decades, it's been about 50%. So, as a social scientist, you can say this is not a blooming success. If you compare with the United States, the figures are much higher in terms of how people feel about their country. Going backwards just now is related to the crisis, but I also think that we have to accept that the big bang of expansion in the middle of the last decade, it takes a while for countries to get used to the European Union. So taking a measurement now, only less than a decade since they joined, and in a period of economic instability, they've gone through the honeymoon, these countries. They were maybe not ecstatic to join, but nonetheless pretty enthusiastic. That now they are in the reality that some of the dreams that they perhaps expected out of the European Union didn't come. Crisis or no crisis, I think you could probably expect that there would be a drop back. In fact, I was very surprised to see that 2 years after the expansion that drop hadn't already happened. But now it has happened, and it will be a gradual process. Hopefully, I'm optimistic that this process will continue a pace of exchange between the countries, of continued economic growth, I certainly hope, which will probably build these figures back up again. But the big challenge, if the leaders of the European Union are concerned that it should be something important, which I think is important to keep in mind, the member states, you didn't ask me what are the sources of diversity, but of course one of the big sources of diversity is the fact that the project is built on national states. And national states have an internal project to be a strong nation, to have a national identity. And this always works in counter to the European Union project. So I don't think we should be so surprised to see that these figures are not really great.
But you're suggesting like the adaptation period after the enlargement coincides with the crisis period, making it more complicated,
Exactly.
right? We have more than 26.6 million Europeans jobless, and that includes 5.5 million under the age of 25. I noticed that European Union already has a project targeting youth unemployment, but is that enough? And what else can be done to boost the confidence of the young generation?
again, you pose sometimes very, very difficult and complicated questions. I'm ecstatic that there is a consciousness, and I think the political leaders you asked, do they listen? Yes, they listen to the youth. You hear about the danger of a lost generation. Again, European history teaches us that a situation of hopelessness leads to possibly extremely dangerous political cocktails. So investing in the youth and making sure that people do not remain unemployed at the beginning of their life so that they do not get into the labor market is extremely, extremely important. Is it enough? Is it the right way? Can we just stimulate jobs? Will they be little tiny jobs? What will happen? Again, I like to always speak for my own shop, as we say in Dutch. So my own shop is academics and education. Creating jobs, yes, but also there's a big mobility of young researchers out of Italy into Belgium and elsewhere in Europe because there is no jobs in research in Italy right now. The universities are closing down in Spain. I never see Spanish colleagues at conferences anymore. So education, which is the key to innovation and research and also for the future of young people, bright young people.
But that country is losing them.
Exactly. The job creation schemes are not for somebody with a PhD in biochemistry. They're for people that can learn to be a plumber or be an electrician or so forth, but they're not for these people that are also unemployed and become really lost investments because countries have been investing in these people for years in terms of their long education. So it needs to be a multi-pronged approach.
But European leaders are actually very worried about those young people who are not willing to go to the polls for the next year's parliament election. So because in 2009 elections, the turnout rate was only 43%, and many question the democratic legitimacy of the union. So are you optimistic for the next year's elections?
No, really? Not really, no. Okay, people are not voting at the national level either. Young people are not so engaged with politics. They're engaged with certain kinds of politics, but not the established politics. And so this has been a trend of how to get young people to go to the polls in all the European countries at the country level. And many political scientists say, well, the issue at the European level is, first of all, that it's not the kinds of popularity contests of known figures that you would see at the national level. European Union is still really not known in a lot of countries as a level that makes a difference in people's lives. And it's just not exciting. I mean, people like to follow an election like an election of an American president because it's exciting and it's a drama and it goes across all of the states of the United States. So many people, time and time again, have said, why can we not have all Europe elections?
Is it also true that we don't have a common identity, European identity in the true sense?
Common identity. I think there will have to be a new kind of identity forged, and certainly we're in a new century. Identities mean different things. So we were talking about young people and how they identify with this. I think there's quite a bit of focus on one's own individual identity. Well, what does it mean to be a European? Why should we, relatively affluent individuals on the world scale, so even though there is poverty, even though there are great problems, why should we need another identity coming from the top? What's in it for us? It's useful when you're out, but it's not necessarily so useful, for me to say to a Spaniard, I'm a European. European citizenship should become more valued. So at present, national citizenship tends to trump European citizenship. And there is no way you can directly apply to be a European citizen. You always have to go through the nation state. So there would be a number of steps to create a real, meaningful European citizenship. But I think if there were seriousness about this becoming something that you would have as your identity, it also has to be backed up with policies like there is a European citizenship. It's not just you have a Belgian passport and so you're a European citizen.
What is the glue that may keep Europe together and its people united?
The glue is I suppose it has to be right now, the only real thing is the economic potential. That what brings countries in is the ability to be able to trade with lower transaction costs and with their close neighbors. That brings these countries in. We're going to be able to do better because we can get rid of our products and our people's abilities on a much larger market. So that's still, I think, an important glue.
Economic development at similar levels and as a common market.
Exactly, exactly. I'm ashamed to have to say that, but I think that's where we are right now, and that's why the crisis is such a threat.
Okay, thank you, Professor, for sharing your thoughts with our global audience. That's all for today. Thank you for watching.